Okay, good evening, Professor. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Professor Pradley, for this chance. I'm Edouard Dossetto. I work under the direction of Gaël Giraud and Christophe Chaureau on the macrodynamics of the transition in order to identify governmental intervention capable of ensuring a shift between a brown capital-based society to a green capital-based society. This work is the last part of my PhD thesis at the Centre d'économie de la Sorbonne. And the other sections address the introduction of expectation into stock flow consistent inventory dynamics and sensitivity analysis conducted at Columbia University last spring at the invitation of Professor Stiglitz. So I'm very interested in your feedback on the transition model, so the second part, and particularly on the last part of the presentation concerning the introduction of the carbon tax and public subsidies into green R&D. So this work starts from the need for immediate action and to accelerate the transition as recreated by the several IPCC reports, which equal to the British Petroleum's latest energy report, concluding that the world is on an unsustainable path. The consumption of hydrocarbon in grey, red, and green, is indeed not decreasing at all. So if British Petroleum itself considers we are consuming too much oil, maybe there is really a problem. So we can ask what levers a government can use to accelerate this transition to a low carbon society, for example, through the carbon tax in the sense of the Stern-Stiglitz report to the Commission, or through subsidies or investment for green R&D. But the environmental crisis we are facing is accompanied by a crisis in our microeconomic models, as Professor Stiglitz pointed out, in where macroeconomists went wrong, among others. Some of them are really funny. And in fact, most of the neoclassical models we are still using are based on assumptions that I'm reviewing here, and some of these assumptions prevent us from capturing non-linearities or bad equilibrium, such as those that might be posed by a climate-driven Minsky moment, the expression from McCartney from the Bank of England. So some of these assumptions may need to be reviewed, such as the assumption of rational expectation, for example, or aggregate demand. So, okay, it's not Sonnenschein, non-Teldebro, it's Lawrence Fishburne in Matrix. And in my work, I'm working on mainly on matrices. So to model the transition, a major reference is obviously the article by Acemoglu-Aguillon. The paper introduces a directed technical change in an equilibrium model with clean and dirty inputs, but it is based on a production function with a constant elasticity of substitution, so it's highly substitutable inputs. Among the other conclusions of the paper we will examine at the end of the presentation, Acemoglu et al. Stated that when dirty and clean inputs are highly substitutable, carbon taxes and public subsidies to R&D are sufficient to avoid a disaster fostered by climate change. And we are aiming at offering an alternative model in a more non-linear framework. So the framework is using a Goodwinkin approach based on a Lotka-Volterra predator-prey logic in which private debt matter and with not fully substitutable inputs, types of capital. And we seek to compare our conclusion. So this work is linked in a broader program of the Energy and Prosperity Share, in which you can analyze climate feedback loop or the depletion of resources and biodiversity with greater robustness of the model. So the study is inspired from the revival of the Minsky financial instability hypothesis as formalized by Keane, and our framework is the last one, so the one of Grasselli and Costa Lima 2012, which integrates this formalization. And I'm interested in the introduction of two different types of capital, based on the article of Stiglitz and Stiglitz 1969. These are other references we are using for government intervention. It's the second one, carbon taxes with the Stiglitz report, and the last one about the formalization of subsidies. So we briefly present the Grasselli and Costa-Lima model, which is the core of the transition model. So with several hypotheses on production, demand adjustment, and the link between employment and wages through a short-term fixed curve. The system is built to reflect some of this economic truism about wage, omega, employment rate, lambda, and debt ratio of the economy, D. And so we will find this system in the last part of the presentation. And I would like to draw your attention on the fact that this system is highly nonlinear and can lead to multiple equilibria, so the good, the bad, and the slavery. And sorry. And the good equilibrium is a locally stable solo equilibrium, so with a positive wage share and employment rate and a finite level of debt, so everything is okay. The bad equilibrium corresponds to a Fisherian crisis. So you have an excessive private debt, which is causing deflation. You have employment and wage tends toward zero, and the debt ratio is skyrocketing. And unfortunately, this equilibrium, the bad one, the explosive debt, is also locally stable. And we will not study the slavery one because it is structurally unstable. So these are the trajectories of the two economically meaningful equilibria. We can review them in a minute when we have introduced the two types of capital. This is a compelling extension when you can look at the initial values leading to a particular equilibrium. It is called basin of attraction. So among the different features of the transition model, we introduce, so it's the two types of capital. One brown, one green, with each one has its own labor productivity and capital to output ratio. And the major difference is that the price of brown energy, assumed constant first, impacts the net profit of firms. For the sake of simplicity, we use an assumption about the same capital to labor ratio. And we introduce two new transition variables at the end of the new differential system. So the first part is the same part as before. It's the system of Grasselli and Costa-Lima. And the transition is said to take place if theta, so the share of green investment, tends to 1, and epsilon, the volume of brown energy, tends toward 0. We also introduce at the middle a model about subsidies and taxes for the government. And we can identify at the bottom part of the slide in red a criterion we will ensure the transition for the theta, the green part of investment. So the simple, necessary and sufficient condition for transition is this simple criterion. And the transition takes place if the brown energy, the price of brown energy, PE, is greater than the differences between output to capital ratio. This differential system has two steady states for transition, full green or full brown. This is why we call it simple. And in each case, you can have an explosive debt equilibrium or the good solo equilibrium. So here is the green solo equilibrium with a high level of private debt first to increase the investment in green technology, and you have a better final situation than a brown solo equilibrium where the private debt is slowly increasing and you have a lower level of wages and employment. So to shift the system from the brown solo equilibrium must be destabilized with maybe so carbon taxes on brown energy price, or by attracting investment in green R&D to increase green output to capital ratio. So inspired from the other form of taxes previously introduced in other papers like Costalima and Grassi, we tested a carbon tax parameterization according to the Stern-Stiglitz report. But so this is a form of the tax equation, and we tested the new state variable, a carbon tax share. But despite our efforts, the brown solo equilibrium remains locally stable due to this form of taxes. So even the highest level of carbon tax, with this highest level, the sign of the criterion to guarantee transition does not change. So this is some slides. So if we are going from a mainly brown society, where the carbon tax reaches an asymptotic value, in fact, and this value is not sufficient to change the sign of the transition criterion. So the final situation is still brown solo equilibrium. That's why we try to introduce investment in R&D. I'm sorry. So we sought to modify the labor productivity of green capital using the assumption of the same capital to labor ratio, and in order to influence the green output to capital ratio. So we use the formalization of a model close to ours, and we introduce this model leading to a variable output to capital ratio. And we observe that the brown society at the beginning of time a shift to a green one with carbon taxes nudging the investment. So, to conclude, we introduced, in fact, the two types of capital in a more non-linear framework than the model of Acemoglu at Aguillon. And in this framework, we can lead to multiple equilibria, and we have identified a simple criterion we tested with different public policies such as carbon taxes and subsidies. And the conclusion are that in this framework and with this particular form of taxes, the carbon tax only cannot destabilize the brown solo equilibrium. However, when you directed these carbon taxes to investment in green R&D, you can act as nudges for orientating private investment. The last part is just a comparison of the conclusion of the two papers, but so in Acemoglu and et al., you have carbon taxes and public subsidies which can guarantee the transition, but in this model, the two types of capital are highly substitutable, which can be questioned. And in our model, we tried with non-substitutable capital. The next step will be to check the behavior of public debt and to add a climate feedback loop, which is not the case here. But we can add it thanks to the work of Bovary et al. 2018. And unlike Acemoglu et al., who stated that we have to stop long-term growth, here we have a green solo equilibrium with a balanced growth path. However, with exhaustible resources or with renewable resources that are renewed at a finite speed, there is a work undertaken by Roston et al. Showing that this green solo unique equilibrium is in fact stationary. Thank you for your attention.
Well, again, thank you very much for, I think it was a very interesting presentation. Maybe the way I'll begin my comments is to observe, since today was a day they gave the Nobel Prize. A year ago, they gave a Nobel Prize to somebody who'd done work in climate change, Bill Nordhaus, and I want to highlight how bad his work is, in terms of undermining and contrast it with what you've seen here. The problem is that he consistently argued, although he's gotten a little better in recent years, that we didn't need to do very much about climate change. That it was better to wait, and that underneath his analysis was a view about discounting, that the cost of doing something was the cost of not doing something once you discount at the appropriate rate. The optimal policy was to do nothing. And the kinds of discount rates he was using around 7%. And those are the kinds of numbers that Trump has been using. And those numbers are the kind of numbers that one sees in calculations based on the opportunity cost of capital. But well before he had done his work, there was a lot of work that was done in public finance on the appropriate discount rate. And that really clarified what was wrong with the approaches that he was taking. And there are at least three things that I want to call attention to. The first is that, and probably the most important, is the presence of uncertainty. And one of the things that eventually it would be nice in your dynamic model to include is uncertainty. And here, the point that Marty Weissman, who just recently died, is really important. When you have when you have uncertainty about the models and the parameters of the model, he showed that there are very fat tails in your priors. And with very fat tails in your priors, there is, in effect, very high levels of risk aversion. In fact, expected utility may not be defined. Making it even worse is the negative correlation. The stakes of nature, where climate change turns out to be much worse than we thought, are precisely the stakes of nature where we will not have the resources to deal with it. So in the states of nature where, for instance, Manhattan is underwater, some people think the fact if only southern Manhattan is underwater, which is where Wall Street is, that will be a good thing. But the real big risk is if all of Manhattan, including where I live, is underwater, that will be a bad thing. So the point is that the stakes of nature where things are really bad are precisely the stakes of nature where we won't have the resources to combat, respond, to adapt to those circumstances. So that negative correlation has to be taken into account when you do any cost-benefit analysis. And his models didn't do that. And to me, that's a first-order effect. In the IPCC 1995 report, Ken Arrow and I and a few others wrote an analysis of how you deal with cost-benefit with uncertainty. And in that case, what you can show is that the rate of discount, the implicit rate of discount, should be much lower. In fact, it could be even negative. When people buy insurance, it has a negative, expected return because it is negatively correlated with the stakes of nature where your margin utility is high. So the point I'm trying to make is that there's a lot of work that has been done in economics that has not incorporated uncertainty, and that really gives you a biased analysis of the appropriate policy response. The second thing that his work did incorporate was the limit, which is in some ways related, the limited ability to engage in, or the fact that we don't engage in perfect intergenerational redistribution. So if you write down a model where you have assume that society acts as if it were maximizing a dynastic utility function, you're not really capturing what goes on in society. A much better model is to think of this, and it's a little bit along the first talk, much better to think of this as overlapping generations models, where there is limited intergenerational redistribution. And if that is the case, then of course, what happens to future generations is not fully captured by market interest rates. It may be higher or may be lower, but in particular, if there are backstakes of nature, the margin utility of future generations may be much higher. That is to say that if the bad events that I describe occur, there's no insurance policy that's going to pay off for them. They're not going to go and say, oh, but you promised me. They're not going to say to their great-great-grandfathers, you promised me that if you didn't do anything, we would be okay. And you said, don't worry, because we'll save money for that back contingency. Well, you say you didn't save enough. What are you going to do now? And the fact is that we don't really save enough. That limited, so the the market rate of interest reflects the margin rate of substitutions within a current generation, but not the margin rate of substitution across generations. And that's a fundamentally different idea. And again, he didn't understand that. This is really important for policy purposes. I'm participating now in a suit against Donald Trump, the administration, on behalf of 21 young Americans who are claiming that Trump's policies are depriving them of their basic rights and violating what is called the public interest doctrine, that each generation holds our natural environment as a fiduciary, as a trustee for future generations. It's a principle that's incorporated in the Justinian Code and been incorporated in most governments' legal frameworks. It's within the American framework. And so we're claiming that these young people's interests are not being well reflected in policy, precisely because the Trump administration is using a 7% discount rate, which means that the value of what happens to something in 50 years is almost worth nothing. So they're not getting due process. Okay, the third point is where he goes very badly wrong, is not introducing nonlinearities. And that's connected with this, and that's what I wanted to, sorry it took so long to come to your paper, but it is really important to introduce complexity and nonlinearity. And nonlinearity both in the dynamics of the system and in the loss functions that you experience. And the kinds of models that Nordhaus has used and that have consistently said, don't worry, have not incorporated adequate, paid adequate attention to these nonlinearities and the complexity of the dynamic complexities. And that's why this work is important, because it's the beginning of a move of trying to create better nonlinear models. Now, in that, I guess the main these models are difficult, and particular assumptions play a big role. And I think you're perfectly right to emphasize that some of the earlier literature that was less concerned assumed a high degree of substitutability between different kinds of capital goods, or between, the nature of the production function makes a great deal of difference. So I think the emphasis on the nature of the production function, the degree of substitutability is important. It's also important to recognize that changes in technology are endogenous, and we can change technology. I would have emphasized a little bit more a concept I call localized learning by doing. This was an idea that Tony Atkinson and I developed many years ago, where we pointed out that as you use a particular technology, it improves. So if you are using dirty fossil fuel technology, you get better at doing fossil fuel. But if you force firms to go to a clean energy, then they get better at doing that. There are 2 points of this. One of them is that whenever you do R&D, there's going to be spillovers. And so the market solution is going to be inevitably inefficient. You appropriate a lot of your returns, but not all of them. And that's why there has to be public investments in R&D. Even if you can induce innovation by subsidies or a carbon price. But the second, that also leads me, and this is probably the most important, I don't want to say criticism, but I think the appropriate way to deal with these problems are regulation. In the context where we can identify a brown and green technology, just don't allow the brown technology. Why go through all this difficulty about will a price, carbon price, be able to get the green technology? Now, the world is actually more complicated because you've specified the model where we can easily observe what is green and what is brown, and there are many variations, many different things, and so I think it is, you do need a carbon price. But there's a sort of an intellectual problem. To the extent that we can see the difference between brown and green, we ought to regulate it. So in the case of automobiles, we can measure the pollution. And so we can regulate that. And there is no reason why we have to allow fossil fuel cars. I was in a meeting with I don't know if this is going to happen, but I was in a meeting with China's premier, with some auto companies. And he told them, this was a couple of years ago, he said, if you don't become all electric within 5 years, you're out of our country. This was Ford, the head of Ford. He came there to try to get some lobby, and he got hammered over the head by the Chinese premier. Now, whether this will happen is but the fact is, governments can't say you have to be a renewable energy car. Now, this is an important aspect of the dynamic transition that you can't get in a macro model, but I think you need to sort of enrich. If you have electric cars using electricity made by coal-fired electric generating, you can actually worsen the atmosphere. So as you at least ought to increase the complexity by having a brown and green electric generating sector and then a brown and green production sector, because that sequencing of transition is really one of the critical issues in the transition. Normally we don't think about these sequencing issues. How do you produce the coal? Produce the steel that's going to produce X? Because somehow it's always in the background now. But that's the issue that people used to have to solve. And I think we're back at that kind of thing where you have to think very carefully about sequencing. And that's why you say, well, the first order of business is not a problem in France, but it is a problem in Germany, and it's a problem in the United States. The first order of business, if we're going to move toward electric cars, is going to be getting electric generating, renewable energy-based generating capacity. And so I think the dynamic models are really particularly helpful in helping us think through those kinds of transition paths in a slightly more disaggregated model. I think you need, there's always a modeling problem. How do you get the optimal degree of modeling where you don't want to have 20 sectors where you can't see what's going on, but you want to have enough disaggregation where you are able to address some of the key issues in the green transition.